Welcome, everyone, to the 10th Annual Vanier College Humanities Symposium. The theme of our symposium this year is Reconnections, and we are reconnecting with a speaker who spoke a number of years ago who greatly impressed the audience and left an impression on us, and so we decided to invite her back. Before we begin, let me just acknowledge the land that we are currently viewing this presentation on is situated on the traditional territory of the Ganyangahaga peoples, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst different nations. We recognize and respect the Ganyangahaga as the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters on which we meet today. And let's begin. Heba Mostafa, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Silva. It's a real privilege to be back, and thank you for inviting me back.
I hope you're well and keeping well during these crazy times.
Yeah, it's always great to be reconnecting.
Before we have you begin, let me just give the audience a sense of your background very briefly. Heba is an assistant professor at the Islamic Art and Architecture Department at the University of Toronto. She received her doctorate from Cambridge in 2012, and her research focuses on Islam's interface with late antiquity, Christianity, and Judaism through commemorative architecture. So with that in mind, let's begin because we have a lot to discuss during this very short time we have you. Let me just set the stage because what we're going to be discussing is the early period of Islamic history. And you're going to be looking specifically at some of the architectural wonders of that time. But let me just set the historical stage very briefly for our audience. The Prophet Muhammad dies in the year 632. And immediately after his death, the Arabs within Arabia begin an expansion outside of Arabia, the famous conquests. And during this time, it was a period of great victories, but also upheavals as a number of conflicts emerged with who was going to succeed the Prophet Muhammad. By the year 711, Islam had reached India to the east and Spain to the west. And it's during this period, roughly 100 years, that we start seeing some of these early examples of Islamic architecture. Heba, can you give us some examples of some of these earliest examples of sacred space that we see in this developing period of Islam?
Absolutely. So just to sort of situate us, this is a map of the Umayyad Empire, and as Sivak mentioned, this is the extent of the expansion in the early 8th century. And the sites where we see our earliest sacred spaces are focused, unsurprisingly, on cities like Mecca, Medina, and what later becomes the capital in Damascus. And something that's helpful to think about, like our theme is reconnections. And in fact, thinking about sacred space, it's really important to think about Islam establishing itself as offering a realignment and a reconnection with an understanding of God. So thinking about these earliest spaces, think about the fewest degrees of separation from God, which is why our earliest sites include the Kaaba in Mecca, which Muslims over time come to see as God's house, and which is described in the Quran as one of God's chosen locations on earth, so inherently sacred. On the upper right-hand side, you can see the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And of course, that is the first mosque in Islam. It's also the site where the Prophet Muhammad is buried. And if you think about degrees of separation, if Mecca is designated as inherently sacred, God's house and the location of pilgrimage, then the Mosque of the Prophet is sort of the next degree, where it's a space focused around the Prophet as a charismatic figure, as a messenger and prophet of God, around which the community now gathers. So thinking about these degrees. On the bottom right-hand side is the third site that's considered one of the three most sacred sites in Islam, and that is the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem. And that building with a golden dome, it's known as the Dome of the Rock, and we'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about that too. So thinking about these spaces as a hierarchy that are connected to degrees of separation from God, degrees of separation also from God's prophet. So Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem.
the sites that we are seeing here, what functional role did they play in society, in specific to the particular parts of the world we're looking at, and also in terms of society in general?
Yeah, I love this question because when we think about function, we immediately think about something that may not have meaning. And I guess I kind of want to challenge and problematize this notion of the function of sacred spaces, because I spoke about this relationship with God and degrees of separation in terms of how Muslims view themselves in relation to God. But it's important to kind of take a step back and understand that at the core of Muslim belief, similar to pretty much any faith tradition, but particularly Judaism and Christianity, there lies a covenant. And that covenant is like a contract. It's a binding contract between humankind and man and God. And that contract is actually spelled out in the Quran, right? So that contract is a contract made between God and Adam, right? It's described that way in the Quran. But that's a covenant that all humankind are then bound by. And in a way to understand these spaces, you have to understand them as the spaces to enact this covenant through ritual practice, specifically in Islam, communal ritual practice. So what we're looking at here, of course, is the Kaaba during the season of pilgrimage. And what you're seeing, these circles around the Kaaba, these are Muslims gathering to uphold the covenant through ritual practice, specifically through the annual pilgrimage known as Hajj. So thinking through this function, the Kaaba has a function, but if you go farther back, the function of these spaces is to uphold a covenant. And that's kind of a platform that you can understand pretty much any sacred space in Islam. But then, of course, there's another aspect to that covenant, which is temporal. So thinking about this covenant is not just something that is believed, but is something that is practiced, and specifically in Islam, is practiced regularly throughout the day, throughout a lifetime. And what we're looking at here is a reconstruction of the best of our knowledge of what the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina may have looked like in its earliest conception. And it looks like a very simple structure. On the top of the slide, there are a few columns. We know that part of the structure was columned. Most of it was a courtyard. And to the left would have been the residence of the Prophet. Now, there are lots of debates around this early mosque. It's difficult because we have no archaeological evidence. What we do know, we know from interpretations of text. But to think about how this covenant is enacted through ritual, the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina is a very valuable source of information, because the Prophet Muhammad at this point is, as God's messenger, is sharing knowledge around how the covenant can be enacted, and specifically in the case of the mosque, through ritual prayer. So when we think about the functional role of sacred spaces, yes, they're spaces where Muslims can perform pilgrimage, where Muslims can gather to pray, specifically in congregation. But they serve another function as well, because the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina sets this precedent of the mosques serving all the functions needed in society that can be, that require the guidance of a religious and political figure such as the Prophet Muhammad. For example, teaching, the Prophet taught in his mosque. Adjudication, he held court in his mosque. Members of the community who were disenfranchised would gather in the mosque. And I mean by that, arrivals to Medina who were impoverished would stay in part of the mosque. And so in a way, the mosque serves the function of a multi-use space. So when we think about the function of sacred spaces, inherent to Islamic sacred spaces in terms of function is whatever the Muslim community needs to uphold their covenant with God, which also entails healthy functioning of society. So whatever the society needs. And of course, over time, mosques become more specialized. And we see some of these functions kind of leaking out of the mosque and inhabiting other spaces. But if you kind of stay focused on that understanding, you'll always be able to understand these sacred spaces. But I can't move on before saying that fundamentally the function here was about a relationship with God. And that is it serves a meaningful function, while also the practice of the ritual that allows Muslims to uphold this covenant. And I've got one final kind of image that we'll talk a little bit more about this, but if you notice how very, very different the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina as a plan is from the mosque we're going to talk about in a minute, which is the mosque in Damascus, you can tell just by looking at the ground floor plan that the function is changing and shifting. But we'll get into that when we talk about religion and politics.
Thanks. When you were discussing the community and the function of the mosque, I immediately thought back to a time my wife had traveled to Morocco, and we were walking in, I believe it was Fez, throughout the old city, and we walked past one of the historic mosques, and there was a congregation of kids sort of gathered around someone who was handing out sweets. And I thought that was terrific. You're sort of creating the sense of groundedness within the community as these kids and the mosque are brought together in this what would appear to be just this mundane act of people giving sweets out to kids, but there's a deeper message. You could draw it to the charitable functions that mosques serve, but also as the sort of the axis mundi, or the sort of center point for that community.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to the next question.
Sure.
Can you highlight some of the ways in which religion and politics intertwine? And here again, I'm thinking of another mosque. I'm thinking of the Grand Mosque at Cordoba. And so the Grand Mosque of Cordoba, just to give the audience some sort of understanding of it, it was a mosque that was built by a series of Umayyad refugees who were pretty much asked to leave the Middle East. But they never forgot Damascus, and they never forgot their love affair for Damascus. And so one of the ways in which they presented their love affair with Damascus was by building the mosque in Cordoba. But that mosque also had this political function. It reminded the folks who would ask the Umayyads to leave, specifically the Abbasids, that they're still around, they're building, and they're still very faithful in their connection with God. So Heba, what's that connection between the mosque, the religion, and politics?
Invoking the Great Mosque in Cordoba is certainly relevant because we see it first absolutely in Damascus. And you can, looking at Damascus and Cordoba in parallel, you can actually see this sort of specialization of space around this political and religious identity. But I want to kind of come back to this idea, if we recall the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina, where it's one space serving multiple functions, and one leader that embodies the political and religious identity very fully. And I mean by that, the community saw in the Prophet Muhammad a complete figure capable of political leadership and spiritual guidance, right? Now, what happens after the Prophet's death is that we have a radical shift where, and you mentioned this at the beginning, where succession to the Prophet becomes problematized because of the shift in identity. And no matter how caliphs position themselves, and they do, they try to embody a faceted identity. They can never make a claim to rival the Prophet Muhammad in that way and still be credible as leaders of the Muslim community. Like, there's an inherent contradiction. So thinking about what happens in these mosques, and we're looking at another reconstruction here. This is also the Great Mosque of Damascus. But if you look, you'll notice that to the south is a palace. And so what we start to see, of course, is that the palace, or the house of governance, or the Dar al-Imara, becomes closely attached to the mosque, where the caliph resides in close proximity to the mosque, to the extent of them really being one complex. So the caliph can leave his audience hall and walk through a private courtyard into the mosque. So when I explain this to people, I try to help them understand this is one entity, this is one building, one complex, with a side that is mostly for political functions in the audience hall, where ambassadors and dignitaries arrive. But the mosque is also serving at that interface of religion and politics. So to give the example of the Great Mosque of Damascus, what a scholar, Sauvager, who was writing in the first half and second half of the of the 20th century, he talks about the appearance of the language of the palace in the mosque. And that's because the identity of the caliph is becoming more faceted. So thinking about monumental domes that we begin to see in mosques, we see that first in a location in front of the mihrab, which is a niche that marks the direction towards the Kaaba, on the wall facing the Kaaba, known as the Qibla wall. That dome begins to represent the presence of the caliph in the mosque, symbolically marking the place of rule, the place of the caliph in the mosque. So even as the caliph is leading the community in prayer, delivering the Friday sermon or the khutbah, he is also standing beneath a space that marks him as caliph. And of course, in a site like the Great Mosque of Damascus, we see Quranic verses, and this is maybe the best example of the intertwining of this identity. We see Quranic verses, which unfortunately haven't survived, but we know them from texts, that talk about the relationship in the Quran between God's authority, the caliph's authority, and the well-being of the community. So you couldn't find a better demonstration of the caliphs bringing their authority, trying to create a credible, faceted identity that's both political and religious, but they can never escape the fact they are not the Prophet Muhammad. And in many ways, this is a driving force. When we talk about Cordoba, that's what we see in the Maqsura of Al-Hakam II. And if you're listening to this and you don't know what that looks like, after the lecture, please go ahead and look it up. But the final thing that I'd like to kind of highlight in this section before we move on, you'll understand it if you look at a cross section, right? In plan, this monumental dome marking the space of the caliph doesn't strike you in the way that it does in the interior. And as you enter the mosque space is very egalitarian spatially. And I mean by that, all spaces are accessible, all spaces are spatially equal. Any Muslim can walk through any space of the mosque. But then as you approach the mihrab, which is kind of the space that over time acquires more sanctity, suddenly you're struck by this rising dome. And that's your cue, that's your reminder that this is where the caliph stands. And in a way, if we want to think about politics and religion, the Maqsura dome, or the dome over the private enclosure of the caliph, that is your cue. That is where, because the caliph is not the Prophet Muhammad, he needs architecture, right? In many ways. So that's kind of where we start to see it.
Fantastic.
So sorry, one final thing before we move on, just as a concrete demonstration, is the mimbar, right? So in Islam, they have a problematic relationship with thrones and seats of rule, but where they do become very comfortable assuming this sort of elevated position is in the pulpits in mosques. And these are just a couple of examples. The left one is by Saladin, who took it from his uncle Nuruddin and brought it to Jerusalem after the end of the Crusades. And the image on the right is from a mosque in Cairo. But thinking about this early politics and religion intertwining the mimbar is a really great demonstration of this identity, because for all intents and purposes, they are presenting as thrones, and a sultan or a caliph is sitting on them, preaching to the community a message that is political and religious. Sorry to interrupt you there.
No worries. I was just going to think, going back to Cordoba, the minbar in Cordoba, I think stands, for me at least, as one of the highlights in Islamic architecture, the way you have a bit of outside light coming in, the way the Quranic verses go across the arch, but also in light of what you just said, it is where the caliph or the leader, the emir or the sultan, takes up the role and gains legitimacy. Why don't we turn to some student questions or audience questions? I think I've got a few right here. Here's one that, can you speak a bit about how Islamic architecture has influenced the architecture around the world? How do we take that question?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Influence is a tricky concept. As art historians, we're very careful how we use the word influence, because it often implies that something is exerting a force on another thing. So like, to influence someone is to assume that you have sort of that kind of elevated position or power over them. So I prefer to kind of think about architectures in conversation. And if we look at examples of Islamic architecture in conversation with other traditions, because of the extent of the Islamic Empire, from India to Spain, and the duration of the Islamic Empire, you're really talking about a tradition that has been in deep conversation visually and architecturally with Europe and with large swathes of Central Asia and Africa. So it's hard for me to point to a single monument But I think my answer would be think about monuments in conversation, even as far afield as California, where we see the influence of motifs that are coming from Spain, that are coming from Damascus, right? So they're more like imprinting of ideas. But it's what's remarkable is that people will often be able to identify something as Islamic. So there is something in aesthetic that they recognize as Islamic. And I challenge my students and sometimes say, what is it about it that makes you point at that and say it's Islamic? Often it's a motif, but sometimes it's something more subtle. Yeah.
And when I teach Islamic architecture in my classes, I do a section on some of the mosque styles. And I show the students in some cases how church styles, for instance, the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, is borrowed if you go to parts of the Balkans and look at some of the mosques, or in parts of Greece where some of the structures of mosques still exist. You'll see replications of the Hagia Sophia in mosque form. And you actually, just as an aside in terms of Montreal, on the corner of Saint-Urbain and Saint-Viateur, there's a church. I believe it's a Portuguese Catholic church, but it actually looks very much like a mosque in that it has a dome and a minaret. And that minaret, every time I look at that minaret, I think this is an influence from the Ottoman architecture or the borrowing. So yeah, it's definitely a connection and a conversation, and that's the human condition. We're constantly.
Absolutely. Thinking about it almost like a gene pool, like Islamic architecture is born out of the traditions of late antiquity, out of the architectural and visual traditions of Judaism and Christianity. And then that gets taken up, develops, and then gets reabsorbed back. So that's why I try to move away from influence and rather think about it's almost like a gene pool. It's intermarriage, it's conversation that then comes back and feeds back into the tradition that it originally borrowed from, right? So yeah, it's a more fluid way to think about it.
I've got some more questions.
Great.
On the topic of influence, how about the use or reuse of architecture and architectural elements in Islamic sacred space?
Right, that's a great one. Now, we have like a technical term for that in art history. We refer to that as spoliation, right? Where something is taken from one monument and reused. And this is a really big topic of study in the field of Islamic art. And I guess the short answer is that if you see an object in reuse, don't assume a single function for that reuse. Because when we see objects in reuse, we have to understand them very carefully in context. So sometimes it's driven by economic reasons. Marble columns are expensive. And if you've got a collapsed building or even a building that has been taken over by a hegemonic power, those elements will be reused, right? So it could be driven by economy. It could be driven by a certain kind of symbolism. So we know that the Caliph al-Walid I, the patron of the Great Mosque of Damascus, specifically wanted particular columns from the Church of the Virgin Mary in Antioch for their sanctity, right? So there are so many reasons why we see objects in reuse. And I think my warning would be, we can't be lazy. We actually have to look very carefully at that object. How is it used? How is it reused? Where did it come from? Do we have evidence about the patron having some particular involvement? Is it being reused for a mundane reason like it was cheaper, right? It doesn't always encode a deeper meaning, but sometimes it does. So we have to be careful. We have to read it like a riddle almost.
I've got one more question before we move on, and keep sending me these questions, folks. As we go through the discussion, we'll pause and have some questions. But I found this question really interesting. Are there some specific colors used more than others in the mosaics you find in mosques? And are there specific reasons why these colors? I'm thinking of the Bukhara, the Mosque of Bukhara with this blue, just as something that first came up to my mind.
That is a great question. And it's another one of these questions where we really almost want a quick answer that this color will always mean this in this context, right? But the truth is that just like we have to read, an object in reuse in context, we have to think about the use of color in context. We're going to look at some mosaics, and I can talk a little bit about the use of color in those mosaics, but we do have some information around a preferred color aesthetic palette that comes from certain traditions. So for example, the use of gold in Byzantine mosaics, which on the one hand exudes luxury, but also does something else that other colors don't do, where it shimmers and reflects light and creates what we call dematerialization of mass, where it makes a heavy building look like it's floating away. So the material and the color used is actually doing so much more than just represent a background. We know the sky is not gold, but what does it mean when we see a golden sky? What does that signal to us, and how does it work on us cognitively in terms of our perception? So that would be one example. So we see a lot of use of color contrast. So in inscriptions, we see dark blue backgrounds with gold. So they're looking for contrast. They're also looking for luxury. The colors have associations that are understood in that society, and the colors are chosen based on those associations. It's hard for us as art historians to make assumptions about those associations unless we have evidence for it. But we can guess, we just have to be honest that we're guessing.
Excellent. Let's move on to the next question that I've prepared. The Mediterranean is a crossroads of various faiths and various peoples and trade and goods and ideas. How do these structures that we're going to be looking at today lend themselves to the interchange between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity?
That's a great question. And we're back in the Great Mosque of Damascus. But I kind of like to preface it first by reminding our viewers how Islam viewed itself, right? So Islam, if you read the Quran and look at all of the teachings of Islam, Islam is very clear that it is part of the monotheistic tradition, which means that Jews and Christians are known as people of the book and are seen as part of a monotheistic family. And relationships between Jews, Christians, and Muslims over time are governed through that logic, right? That means that inherent to Islam is an understanding of Islam being part of a bigger whole that includes Christians and Jews. So you need to have that at the back of your mind as you start to understand how Islam over time interacts with these faith traditions. But for the early Islamic period, something to keep in mind is a really important point, because we cannot ignore this, is that Islam and Christianity in the form of the Islamic Empire and the Byzantine Empire are political rivals. And so we start to see our narratives that are really heavily influenced by the fact that they are fighting each other, right? They are competing with each other over physical territory, over control, and over a claim of religious superiority, right? So we need to keep that at the back of our mind, even as we understand and consider that these religions, or Islam, sees itself as part of a whole. And that kind of brings me to my next point, which is thinking about that contact between Islam and other faith traditions. There is a space of shared cultural encounter that these religions cannot escape, because Islam sees itself as part of this tradition. Jerusalem is inherently important to these traditions, therefore it is inherently important to Islam. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But so is the Great Mosque of Damascus. The Great Mosque of Damascus, before it was the Great Mosque of Damascus, was the Church of St. John the Baptist. We're going to get to that in a moment. So just seeing how these sites over time are shared, but also become points of tension and conflict because of this belief in a space of encounter. And it's a space of encounter that binds these three religions together, whether they like it or not, right? Because of these shared traditions, these shared narratives. Just thinking about the list of prophets that are sacred in Islam, they are the same prophets that exist in Christian and, to a lesser extent, Jewish tradition, just because of how the religions succeed each other. But let's look at a few concrete examples of what I mean by this. So in a case like the mosaics of the Great Mosque of Damascus, and this is where I was referencing the gold, the sky is gold. So this is what I meant by that. This is an image that would not be out of place in a church. In fact, the craftsmen who created these mosaics were almost certainly Christian, right? So we have a Muslim monument constructed by Christian craftsmen using a visual language that belongs to the church. However, it's been modified in the sense that there are no living figures in this image. And while we're on that topic, in sacred spaces and sacred spaces only, Muslims do not represent living beings. And this comes from a very old idea, actually one of the 10 commandments, that thou shalt not create graven images, right? And this is known as iconoclasm. And that is a prohibition on representing living things. It exists in Islam and is enforced in the case of the Great Mosque of Damascus and is more or less consistently enforced, but only in religious spaces. So that's another example of how Islam is also engaging with similar challenges. And iconoclasm existed in Christianity, specifically in Byzantium. There were periods, iconoclastic periods, where they were very uncomfortable representing images in churches, but also it exists in Judaism. So thinking about this space of encounter with similar beliefs around God's relationship to humankind, and iconoclasm would be a really good example of that. But I want to give something that's even more concrete and take you back to the Great Mosque of Damascus. This is a visualization of how this space was originally shared after the Muslim conquest in 634. The original enclosure was part of the Temple of Jupiter, so it dates from the classical period. So the structure you see on the outside with the arcade, that is classical. And then with the Christian control of the city under the Byzantines, they constructed church to St. John the Baptist. When the Muslims arrive, they share that enclosure. So on the right-hand side, you can see the mihrab of the companions of the Prophet. So these would have been the original settlers in Damascus. And to the left, the church continued to function as a church. And here's where my students often, their jaw drops. It continued to function as a shared church until the year 705. That is several decades after Islam had control of Damascus. That means the earliest caliphs ruled from a shared space, a space that was half a church and half mosque. And it was only under al-Walid in 705 where the Great Mosque of Damascus is constructed. And when we read the texts, that was not an easy negotiation. Now, that church was dedicated to St. John the Baptist, and the remains of St. John the Baptist are still housed in the Great Mosque of Damascus. They were reinterred in a shrine, and the mosque then becomes a site of veneration for St. John the Baptist. So when we talk about this interlaying, and that's why I like to frame it as a conversation, this is a shared space, and inevitably these traditions, they have to speak to each other because they hold beliefs that bind them to each other.
The idea of shared space, I'm just also thinking physically where the Great Mosque is located in Damascus. I visited it when I was 15, and I recall vividly going through the souks, which were labyrinthine in terms of sort of making your way to the mosque itself. And so these souks are covered. There's exchange of ideas, there's exchange of goods, there's exchange of a lot of noise and just a cacophony of urban chaos. And then when you enter into that courtyard, you really understand the meaning of sacred space, and you really understand the meaning of the tranquility that these spaces provide. And now you're adding the layer of the politics and the layer of the complexity and the layer of the sharing, which makes these places so rich in terms of what they have to offer us. Every time you go into these spaces, there's something that that touches the senses. Let me turn to some more student questions, if that's all right, Heba.
Yeah.
Let's see what we have here. Can you speak of why the dome is the space shape that facilitates the connection to the divine? Why does the caliph stand under the dome specifically?
Okay, this is another question where I have to give a caveat, right? Not every time you see a dome can you assume that it serves that function. But if you look at the context and the development of the domes and mosques, it's very clear historically that they're borrowing the language of domes from the classical tradition, from the Christian tradition, where domes exude, at the very least, a sense of importance. Now, in the Islamic tradition, we have something even more concrete. If you recall, I showed a slide that had a visualization or a rough reconstruction of the location of the palace in Damascus. Now, here's where things get very interesting, because at some point during the first few decades of the Umayyad Empire, under Caliph Muawiyah, who's the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, founder, if you don't take Uthman ibn Affan into account, if you consider him one of the rightly guided caliphs rather than the first Umayyad. One of the very unusual things that Muawiyah does is that he builds a domed audience hall in Damascus. And the audience hall he builds, he gives it a name. He refers to as Qubbat al-Khadra, or the dome of, if we translate literally, the dome of the green. And scholars have sort of been quite preoccupied by this, something that I'm very interested in as an academic as well, because the green, for a while, scholars thought it meant it was literally green. And they tried to come up with interpretations, and okay, it's the color of vegetation, it was beloved by the prophet, okay, maybe that's the symbolism. But we've since discovered that the green in Arabic actually means the heavens or the sky. So, there are references to, it would be better if the khadra fell on the ghabra, or the sky fell on the dust or the earth.
Heba, I'm thinking of Surat al-Ghashiyah, which is vivid in sort of what it means to enter heaven and sort of the lushness. Sorry for.
No, please, that was a beautiful aside, because we have to understand what it means for an Umayyad caliph. This is before the dome appears in the mosque. It appears in the palace first, where we talked about legitimacy, and you used that term. I'm really glad that you brought it up. Whereas the first caliph ruling after the end of the rightly guided caliphs, whose legitimacy derived from the Prophet Muhammad, and so they had a very close connection, Muawiyah is ruling as a caliph without that protection of legitimacy. Not only that, he only came to power after a very violent and traumatic civil war. So when we think about the dome, to answer the question of what does the dome mean, if you look closely at the history of the use of the dome in early Islamic architecture, they're using it very deliberately. They're using it in the way that Roman emperors used it, like Nero's Golden Dome Palace. They're using it like Sasanian rulers used it, where they would have domes with representations of stars, and according to some narratives that it somehow revolved to represent the heavens. It's the same playbook.
I'm also thinking, we started off our discussion with the land acknowledgement in the Pawnee tradition in in indigenous societies, the idea of the circle as a centering point. There is something very special about circles, very unique about circles in their perfection. And so it does make sense that if you're conceptualizing the divine, a circle in various religious multitudes is going to be one of those symbols that you use. I'm also thinking, of course, of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is just a few, it's like less than a kilometer away from the Dome of the Rock. And one of the later additions to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was the dome. So again, we see that idea.
And of course, depictions of Christ at the apex of the dome. Like, if you have this understanding of how domes can function, just don't make assumptions about their function until you know how they fit into the puzzle.
Let's take another student question, Heba.
Sure.
This is interesting. Is the Ottoman Empire considered Islamic? I would answer yes, but I think here's where they really want us to go with this question. And is its architecture considered to be Islamic?
Oh, that is actually a loaded question. The straight answer is absolutely. The Ottomans are considered to be the perhaps high point of Islamic architecture. Also longevity and breadth of empire. And if we look closely at Ottoman architecture, we see very similar conversations going on. So you mentioned the Hagia Sophia. We see the church and the mosque really in close conversation with each other in later mosques like the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. Absolutely, we would describe Ottoman architecture as Islamic architecture. But the fact the student is asking that question, I'm curious whether they kind of want to understand why we use a term like Islamic architecture. And this is my opportunity to say, there are debates in the discipline around the use of the term Islamic, because there's architecture that is created within the Islamic Empire that is not meant for Muslims. So is a church constructed in 11th century Cairo Islamic architecture or not, right? And so there are these debates. And one of the ways that has been helpful in framing this question is to actually think about Islamic architecture the way we do Roman architecture, where Islam is a stand-in for a culture that encompasses religion, but does not exclude a broader cultural definition.
Let me turn that a bit on its head. I'm just thinking of the Alcazar in Seville, which tourists flock to because it's a model of Islamic architecture. But I teach a course on Islamic Spain, and I take my students there. And one of the things I really get across to them is that much of the sort of Islamic style of architecture that you see there was actually built by a Christian king, Alfonso, who happened to be annoyed at his co-religionists in places like France and wanted to sort of thumb his nose at them by building a palace that used Islamic themes or themes that would have been found in places like Morocco and other parts of Andalusia. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of back and forth, or as you said earlier, a conversation. I love that phrase, a conversation. One more student question before we move on. This one is going back to the borrowings between the different architectural styles. And this student is asking, did that sort of sharing bring about any conflicts between those different religions? So I guess, in today's world where we bristle at ideas like cultural appropriation, is there something similar that was happening at that era back then?
Right. So that is a really great question to think about how, when we think about the Great Mosque of Damascus using visual language of the church, how did the Christian community respond? They certainly noticed, right? And in many ways, so did the Islamic community. So the reaction to the use of the visual language of opulence of the church is something that later Umayyad caliphs had to defend. So there's a really great account in by the historian Al-Muqaddasi, who talks about a conversation between, I believe, Caliph al-Walid and an advisor, where al-Walid is being accused of making the mosque look like the church. And the advisor cites his father, Abd al-Malik, the patron of the Dome of the Rock, by basically saying, the church has power over the people because of this majesty. And Islam has to offer, Islam has to compete visually, essentially, right? Now, this account doesn't really matter if it's true or not. But what is interesting to us is that there is some understanding that the adoption of a visual language can sometimes be about competition, and it's sometimes a very deliberate, we will do our version of your church opulence in a way. But thinking about how particular objects could have been taken into the mosque, there is, so in terms of appropriation, there's a really interesting account from Cairo, where the architect of a mosque built by the founder of the Tulunid dynasty, so it's known as the Mosque of Ibn Tulun. This is another one that I encourage you to look up. So the account goes that the architect, who was a Christian, convinced the Tulunid ruler to build his mosque out of baked brick and piers rather than columns. And the argument in the sources is that because he was a Christian and this mosque was so large, he was afraid that the marble would be taken from churches and used in a mosque. And so when we think about reactions, the fact that Muslims are constructing these arguments around a Christian architect trying to move the caliph in a different, the Tulunid ruler, who would not have been a caliph, into that direction of not appropriating, that's revealing, right? It wouldn't have made sense in the context of the historical account if it wasn't somehow true within the community, if that answers the question.
I think it does. I think it does. Let's move back to our formalized questions, dare I say, though the student questions are fantastic and I totally appreciate them.
Wonderful.
Why these spaces? And here we're talking about Jerusalem, and let's expand it a bit more to the greater Mediterranean region. What makes places like the Mediterranean? And then let me focus more on places like the Nile. Why Jerusalem? Why the Nile? What's so important about these places, the landscapes? Can you comment on that space?
Absolutely. So I've been working on sacred sites for a very long time. And two of the sites that I've become very preoccupied with are the Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary in Jerusalem, which is located on the site of the Temple Mount. And I'll explain what we're looking at on the slide in a moment. But I've also become very interested in nature as inherently sacred. And that ties in with a project that I've been working on for a while on Nile veneration rituals and a specific structure known as a Nileometer. And it took me a very long time to make the connection between the Dome of the Rock and the Nileometer. And I kind of want to give you a visual here, and I promise to come back to the slide on the sanctity of Jerusalem. But this is a view of the Kaaba that was taken right as the COVID pandemic broke out, where access to the site was prohibited. Now, this is something that I don't think in the entire history of modern photography ever happened. So you will never see this view as the Kaaba, as a location, kind of stripped of all the other things that can distract us, as a spot on earth that is being commemorated, but also the rock in Jerusalem. And my students call this God's view, right? Where in a way, we have to remember that Mount Moriah is a mountain. It is a mountain where divine communication is believed to have taken place. And I'm thinking here in the Muslim tradition, but of course, in Christianity and Judaism, this is also the case, with varying beliefs around the nature of that divine communication. So if we peel back all the layers of these sacred sites, we have to confront the fact that God speaks to humankind and relates to humankind in the natural world. Architecture then springs up around it, and rituals spring up around it, and sacred complexes grow around it. But if you take all of that away, you're left with a sacred mountain. And in the case of the Nile, you're left with a river that is mentioned in the Quran, obliquely in the story of Moses, as one of God's agents. The Nile enacts God's will, specifically in the case of Moses. But in a way, the Nile is almost functioning like one of God's messengers. And even thinking about the story of Pharaoh, where it's the Nile that wreaks havoc on Egypt. God punishes Pharaoh through his agent, the Nile. And for me, thinking about the Nile as a sacred agent, thinking about Mount Moriah as a sacred mountain, stripping away the architecture to understand the architecture and taking it back to this idea of the earth and nature are God's creation, and communication with God is inherently linked to a space. And just remember, Quranic revelation, according to Muslim belief, takes place in a cave, right? Where Muhammad withdraws into nature, into a mountain, in order to receive this revelation. So to kind of answer your question of why these spaces, we need to go back to understand this fundamental relationship if we're really going to understand sacred space. We have to get to the root of this notion of a sacralized world. And this is my opportunity to go back again to the slide that I kind of skipped over. On the right-hand side of the slide, and I do have to offer a bit of a warning on this slide. And the warning is that the bottom part of the slide is based on archaeological investigation, right? So this is the Haram al-Sharif as it stands today. To the south of it, those two square structures, those are the remnants of the Umayyad palaces that were connected to the Haram al-Sharif. And those are based on archaeology, right? Above it is an artist's visualization of what the temple may have looked like, right? And that is based on an interpretation of textual sources, but here's what it gets confusing. Parts of it, especially the outer enclosure wall, are based on some archaeology. So I use this image when I talk to my students about the power of the image and the danger of the image, is that we don't have a note saying this is based on archaeology, this is based on an interpretation of a text. Those two things are not equal, right? But if you keep going up the image, you'll see that it ends in sort of this floating rock. That's the tip of the mountain. So I like to use this image, as problematic as it is, because it shows us that link to nature, to the inherent sacrality of Mount Moriah, and all the layers of sanctity that become constructed upon it, right? Now, this is obviously a sensitive topic. This is a site where Muslims, Jews, and Christians, to use the word conversation, is maybe too neutral. But it's something that if we think about it as a conversation, can be helpful as we sort of rewind the clock and try to understand the inherent sanctities. The image on the left is a representation, as an illumination, showing a sort of Muslim imagination of how the Prophet ascended to heaven. And this is at the root of Jerusalem's sanctity, as I'm sure your students are aware. Now, this ascent, this heavenly ascent of the Prophet Muhammad is located on the site of the Haram al-Sharif. And the reason it's located there is because of this inherent sacrality. So by peeling back layers and looking at inherent sanctity, we then have to put those layers back and understand how did they get composed. And that's where story shaping, narrative, pilgrimage, sites of memory, those layers all get added back in, and we end up with things in like the 11th and 12th century, like pilgrim manuals that guide believers through the site and indicate this is where this happened, this is where this sacred event happened, and so on and so forth. And it becomes participatory in that sense. I'm going to wrap and give time for questions, but I just kind of want to come back to the Nileometer, because it's easy for us to understand Jerusalem as sacred. Sacred events happen there. It's a lot harder for us to understand the Nileometer as a shrine, because it doesn't present itself that way. Here's just another shot of sort of just how mountainy the rock is, right? Like it really is a raw object of nature. And there are bits of it that look like it's been hacked away. That happened over time. Pilgrims visiting the site would take fragments of it, which is why the Crusaders covered it to protect it. But to think about the Nileometer, and I'll just say a few words about the Nileometer. The Nileometer is located on the tip of an island in Cairo. It was constructed in the 9th century, so about 180 years after the Dome of the Rock. And it's located on this island to serve as its function of measuring. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, there's a square structure. That's the well where, I'm going to skip ahead here, where a measuring column is located. And what's really remarkable about the Nileometer is that even though it's there to measure the rise and fall of the flood, which had serious economic implications. So the rate of rise and the level of rise is how Egyptians managed their entire economy. When they would plant, how much taxes they would charge, whether they needed to store grain that year. Like there were about 30 decisions that could be made based on the information from this single measuring column. But what's incredible is that it's also treated as a shrine with Quranic verses decorating the interior of the well, where rituals took place honoring the column, which was in contact with the River Nile, which is one of God's agents. And that's where the Nileometer's sanctity derives. So I sort of want to leave it at that for now. And your students' questions are so wonderful and thought-provoking. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Let me just ask, or maybe just comment, in terms of the Nileometer, the connection between Isis and Osiris, the story of death and rebirth, and connecting that with the Nile. To me, there's an obvious link. That's not really where I want to go with this. Where I want to go with this is the Islamic governments. Did they ever make use of pharaonic culture, traditions, or mythology? Or is it because the pharaoh has such a bad rap in the monotheistic traditions that they've simply been skipped?
That's a wonderful question. And it's not easy to answer because it's very situational. So I'll just cite a couple of examples. So without a doubt, Egypt is considered to be like the stage set for kind of like the battle between good and evil, right? So you've got Moses fighting Pharaoh and trying to turn him to the light side, right? So there is this perception, of course, that the ancient Egyptian rulers were problematic from a theological point of view. They had the hubris, they tried to build a tower to reach God, right? There are all of these, and this is something that, permeates rulers of pre-Islam. But when you actually look closely to how the remnants of ancient Egypt are being incorporated into Islamic culture, you'll find that they can't escape, right? And when I talked about a space of encounter and a kind of tethering, a binding that connects Muslims, Jews, and Christians, the same thing is happening in Egypt with the ancient Egyptian past. For example, what are they going to do with the pyramids? And this is where they have this really interesting, and this is something that emerges in textual accounts, where they need to explain the pyramids. They recognize, of course, what incredible monuments they are, right? They can't say they're great builders and then deny that the pyramids must have been built by a great civilization. But there's a paradox where if they legitimize the greatness of the architecture of another civilization, they're also validating them in a way. So they come up with these very interesting narratives in the Muslim accounts, but then in the Coptic accounts, the traditions are different. So this Egyptian identity and connection to the past is something that we have to read very carefully. But for example, they're appropriating pieces of temples and reusing them in mosques, mainly for symbolic or apotropaic functions. That means protection. So they would take a slab with hieroglyphs, turn it upside down, and use it as a door slab. This is where I'm blanking and I'm only thinking of the Arabic word. A crossing, threshold, right? With the hieroglyphs buried downwards to protect the mosque. Now, that seems like a contradiction, but it's not. Another really interesting account, and this is the last one I'll give, and this is from my work on the Nile, is that there's this account of these sphinxes that were on the riverbank that Muslims believed protected the Nile, and that if they were to be removed, the Nile would flood. And according to the historian al-Maqrizi, who is a well-known Mamluk historian, when one was removed, there was a catastrophic flood. So thinking about narratives and ideas around how Egypt functions, you'd think that a Muslim would not believe that an ancient Egyptian pagan sculpture could protect the Nile, because that's in direct conflict with their beliefs about God being the master of the universe. But it's not true, right? So the construction of narrative, the construction of identity, the sort of stories that exist within a culture that allow it to sort of exist in balance and in harmony with each other. And for ancient Egypt, they could never escape it. In Islamic Egypt, they could never escape that past, even if they incorporated it in sometimes bizarre and unusual ways.
Yeah, there's something about that Nile, the Nile. I was lucky at a young age to go on one of those tacky Nile cruises. But to this day, it still resonates with me. You're on this ridiculous boat with tourists, but on either side of the banks, you're passing various monuments and architectural features that span the different civilizations. And then the modern wonders like the lock system and whatnot. So yeah, the Nile is something very spectacular. Hopefully when COVID is over, we can recommend that everyone go and either take a tacky cruise down the Nile or something more serious down the Nile.
And visit the Nileometer.
And visit the Nileometer for sure. Let's ask a few more student questions, and I guess we'll start slowly wrapping this up. Before we end, I just do want to thank Heba for the time you've taken and the answers you've been giving. This is fantastic, but let's turn to some more student questions very briefly. How has having politics and religion in such close quarters influenced those spheres? Is there a separation between church and state? Does this apply?
So what do they mean by spheres? If they could elaborate.
Spheres, I think.
Oh, spheres.
Spheres, yeah.
Yes. So I'll sort of start with the second half of the question about sort of church and state. And there's a well-known statement by a historian of early Islam, Andrew Marsham, describes as in Islam, the church is the state, where the way the Islamic state is constructed is around this concept that religion and politics are two faces of a single coin. And that to lead the community, you need to have a spiritual legitimacy, and that needs to be constructed, but you also need political legitimacy. So these identities over time, of course, shift and change, where like a Mamluk Sultan, for example, ruling from Cairo in the 14th or 15th centuries, would claim a degree of religious authority, but nowhere near the claims that the early caliphs made, for example. So thinking about the Umayyad caliphs or the Abbasid caliphs. So we can't think about this fusion of religion and politics as uniform or a monolith throughout the Islamic Empire. What I'm describing as the church as the state is only true for this very early period. And what we see over time, of course, is that this identity, this fusion, becomes so strained over time, where, the Umayyads eventually lose their power. Not only do they lose their power, but the community is split, and eventually the entire Umayyad family is massacred. Now, that is very controversial for members of the community that support them, because they see them as religious and political figures. But when the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad died in warfare, that created a completely different level of turmoil and upheaval, as we know, as students of early Islamic history know. So the caliphs were not as believable as holding that full sacral identity, because they couldn't support the claim. The Prophet Muhammad could support the claim as the one who revealed the Quran, if that makes sense. So the identity gets strained, basically.
And we can see this throughout Islamic history as the role of the caliph takes a bit of a backseat as sultans and emirs take on the real political functioning. Here again, I'm thinking of the Mamluks, the Ayyubids, and so you see that as the caliph becomes more of a religious figurehead, in some cases absolutely controlled by the military classes and the political classes.
And a lot of what, for example, the Mamluks are a great case study, because a lot of what the Mamluks are doing are trying to reinforce their religious legitimacy as well, which is why they become patrons of charitable foundations. And their piety, or their performance of piety in service to the public, becomes how they assert their religious legitimacy by showing themselves to be good Muslims. because they cannot make a claim. They're descended from nobody. Like, they can't claim it through their bloodline. They claim it through their military prowess, and they claim it through other means. But thinking about political legitimacy, they're still preoccupied with that religious identity. They still need it, but they just can't claim it as persuasively. So they have to, which is why the architecture becomes so important to fill that role.
Heba, Mostafa, I want to thank you very much for taking this hour and a half to spend it with us at our symposium. May we reconnect in person next year and the year after, where we'll definitely have you back and we can have another discussion about your research and about the findings that you're uncovering. Heba, Mostafa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And thank you to the students for their wonderful questions.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great, safe week. Take care, and we'll see you soon online.